Sweet. Well, welcome everybody to Ecolunch. We've got a nice crew here, nice cross-org crew. As a reminder, our Ecolunches at Point Blue are casual lunchtime discussions. These presentations are mostly given by staff, mostly about science, but sometimes we have special guest speakers like today. And sometimes our topics are not about science, but today we will talk about some science. Anybody can present at Ecolunches, so feel free to reach out to me or just schedule one. This is not a one-person show, but I have stepped up to coordinate these, so I'm happy to help if you'd like help coordinating an Ecolunch. So today's topic is bird returns and focuses on partnership-driven conservation work done in the Central Valley of California with agricultural wetlands and shorebirds. We've got guest speaker Rod Kelsey from the Nature Conservancy. So this is our third talk in the wetlands and shorelines theme of Ecolunches. So it's a great one to wrap up this theme for this year on. And in November and December, we'll move into an Ecolunch theme of sharing our experiences with pursuing partnerships with local tribes and Indigenous people. So stay tuned for the schedule and calendar invites for those. As a reminder, I will add links to recordings to our Comms Hub, pointblue.org/Comms Hub in the Ecolunch menu tab. So that's our Ecolunch intro. Welcome to all of our guests here. If you just joined, we did share in the chat the organization we're with, our position, and if we have worked for Audubon or the Nature Conservancy in the past. And also you can share your favorite shorebirds, so you can keep that chat exchange going there. And with that, I will pass it to Catherine Hickey, our Pacific Coast and Central Valley Group Director, to introduce Rod.
Right. I am very happy to introduce Rod Kelsey. He is Associate Director with Nature Conservancy's Water Program. And Rod has been an awesome partner and collaborator for over a decade. I kind of lost count of the years now. Just always inspirational, big picture thinker, sometimes too big picture, got to bring him down to earth on things, but a great compliment to our minds in the partnership. And I'm also pleased to call him my friend. And just a little bit about Rod. Rod oversees California's Rewilding the Central Valley strategy, focusing on developing water and land management solutions in the Central Valley to ensure people and nature get the water and habitat they need when they need it. Specifically, Rod leads TNC's teams focused on strategic habitat restoration in the San Joaquin Valley to achieve sustainable water management, thriving birds and wetland strategies to secure multiple benefit habitat for migratory birds, and application of a water trust model to demonstrate more dynamic water management in the Central Valley. Rod also co-leads some of TNC's research projects, specifically those associated with shorebird migration and habitat restoration in the Central Valley. That's the science that he'll present today. He has over 25 years experience in natural resources conservation, wildlife research, BA in environmental conservation at University of Colorado, MS in biology at California State University, Long Beach, and his PhD from the University of California, Davis. And thank you, Rod, so much for taking the time to join us. And we got Mike Lyons joining, who also was at Point Blue and now is at Audubon.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you for inviting me. This is an honor to get to talk to all these people. I know a lot of you, but I don't know all of you. So I'm excited about the conversation and get to share some of this. And let me just share my screen.
Recording in progress.
People see the screen?
Yep.
Okay. So before I get going, I mean, the first thing I need to acknowledge is everything I'm going to present here is a product of a lot of people on this call. So all of you are going to see a lot of stuff that Point Blue and Audubon have led or contributed to. So this is all a very big team effort. What I'm going to do is share sort of a little bit of the why we're doing what we're doing. For those of you who don't know, most of you probably know the story as well or better than I. What we've been doing and some of the success we've had. And I'm also going to raise some of the questions that bother me about, the future of these programs and the outcomes we're trying to achieve for nature in the Central Valley and in California. So, as all of you know, as well as anybody in the world, we live in a world of change, change we don't like, and just taking stock of how much is changing and how fast, and that we are really a long way from solving these wicked problems that we're all dedicated to solving. And just one example is that 10 million acres of tidal wetland have been lost in the last 50 years. And that's relevant for shorebirds, but it's also relevant for a lot of other things. And how to compensate for this or stem that tide is the subject of so much of what we do. And in the work that the partnership's been doing for all these years, we've been heavily focused on working lands. And actually the origin of the partnership is in no small part because of an analysis that was done by TNC and Audubon in the early days, immediately leading up to the development of the formal partnership, that was trying to take stock of how important different habitats were for migratory water birds and shorebirds in particular. And one of the not so surprising but revealing results of that was that agriculture for shorebirds and a lot of other things was the primary habitat. It was delivering a lot of the habitat and a lot of the food. And that had been known for a while for waterfowl, but it was revealing to look at the importance of these landscapes, broadly speaking. And we also know that working lands are this major driver of natural habitat loss globally. On the left, these are big aquaculture, mostly shrimp farms in Honduras, that are expanding rapidly there and in Brazil and in other places in Central and South America. On the right is coastal conversion in the Yellow Sea. So globally, working lands are pushing, the natural habitat that so many shorebirds and other things depend on, sort of to the brink. And so one of our big questions is, how do we adjust to that and help these birds adjust to that? And that story is a long one, and we know we're a bit of a poster child for that kind of conversion. The Central Valley has lost 95% of its wetlands, almost entirely to intensive agriculture. And this is the kind of data that Blue and others have.
Looks like it's pretty localized.
Yeah,
right on the eastern edge.
hold on a sec, Corey. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a story we know well, and we've actually all contributed to the joint venture in other ways to document these losses and what the impacts are. And we also know that this place was a region of unbelievable abundance and diversity. This is just a quote I pulled out from a historical sort of compilation of what people were observing back in the day. In the mid 1800s, people in the Sacramento Valley were complaining about the noise that the water birds, particularly waterfowl, would make when they arrived in the fall. And so this place has always been a place of tremendous abundance, and it still is, remarkably. So the rice lands in particular, and the valley generally, is still globally important for migratory water birds and shorebirds in particular. It's part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And so it's still this super important place. And a big part of the reason is that we have flooded agriculture. So here's an example of working lands being at least a good surrogate for what we've lost, at least under certain circumstances. And we've seen, in part through flooded agriculture and changes like wetland restoration, some bird groups do well. And we all know the 2019 study that came out, the 3 billion birds report, documenting what was happening to birds in North America. And we saw that waterfowl were actually stable or increasing in many cases. And that's in no small part because of irrigated agriculture and about $6 billion in investment since the 1980s in wetland protection and restoration, expressly targeting waterfowl. But shorebirds, who you might expect to benefit from that kind of activity are not benefiting. That report pointed to an almost 40% decline over the last 50 years. That's 17 million birds fewer in any given year than there were 50 years ago. And the latest State of the Birds report that just came out in the last couple of weeks is pointing again to what the fate of shorebirds, which are second only to grassland birds as a group in the country. And a bunch of a couple of the birds in particular, dowitchers in particular, are on that list of tipping point species, which means 50%. They've lost more than 50% of their population in recent years. And so shorebirds are in real trouble. And they're just one example of some of the reasons why we need to get serious about scaling up the kind of work we do and making it more effective. So what's the problem, for those of you who don't know this already, in the Central Valley? Well, shorebirds lack migration habitat. We've got a lot of flooded rice. We've got this year it's only a couple 100,000 acres, but in years that aren't severe drought, we have 300, 400,000 acres of flooded rice in the winter. And that's part of why waterfowl have done so well. But shorebirds get here earlier. They come through in abundance later. And they need different habitat. And so what happens normally even in the wetlands that you would expect might be managed for a diversity of species typically get managed for waterfowl, and the flooding is in the middle of the winter. And what shorebirds really need is for us collectively as a society to fill in these critical gaps. And over the last several years, these teams, many of them led by folks at Point Blue, have been pointing to the particulars of the challenge these birds face, in addition to just that sort of persistent lack of habitat. And this study, led by Matt at Point Blue, we were looking at the effect of drought. So this is looking at the last drought, and the patterns we're seeing right now are very similar, if not worse. And seeing that the seasonal gaps in habitat are much, much worse in these drought periods. And these are the kinds of events we all know that we need to expect more of in the future that may be more persistent. And so how do we fill in those gaps in a world with highly managed water and a lot of sort of practical and political considerations that make it hard to do to fill in those gaps? And then in more recent work that was led in part by Christy DeBala, who's on the call here, and Greg Gillette from TNC and others, we were trying to look at how much of the habitat, open water habitat generally, and for shorebirds is being delivered by different habitat types. And not surprisingly, something we've known for a long time is agriculture, again, is providing most of the habitat seasonally. Rice is in the orange. Incentive programs that we help deliver is in red, and wetlands are in blue. And for shorebirds, if you look specifically at shorebird accessible habitat, there's a lot less of it, number one, but you see these persistent seasonal gaps on the front end during fall migration and often in the spring. And in the same study, it's pointing towards these energy shortfalls for shorebirds. So the current population, this was done in the context of the joint venture, and these on the left, what are the sort of typical energy shortfalls by season? In the fall and spring, you don't really have energy shortfalls in the middle of the winter because of habitat, even during the beginning of the last drought. And those would only be made worse if we actually achieved our target of doubling the population, which is the joint venture's goal and all of our collective goal. And so what these birds are experiencing, again, from the same paper, are these deficits in energy and food available to them. And for the baseline population, every single year, basically, they're experiencing an extreme deficit. So they're getting here and there's not enough food to even support the current population, let alone a future population. And in the future, if we don't correct this problem, that kind of energy deficit will persist and be stronger in the spring as well. So we have a lot of work to do to try and close these gaps. And fortunately, over 10 years ago, we started this collaboration among the three organizations and with lots of other partners to try and solve this challenge and be a complement to all the other great work that's going on out there. And I'm just highlighting two, mainly because the Bechtel Foundation stepped up and saw the power of us collaborating to try and solve this challenge. And it was also a time where we were all very collectively, as we still do, working very, very closely with the NRCS to improve their programs. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because all of that work that started back then, that began with talking with the farmers, particularly the rice community, and others, was the foundation for all the stuff, bird returns, that I'm going to talk about next. And I'll mention here that also all along the way, Point Blue's partners, partner biologists working closely with NRCS have been close partners both back then as well as currently in shaping and delivering these programs via the NRCS. And so we've been given a lot of opportunity and responsibility and a lot of trust by different organizations. And so what happened, bird returns was an interesting evolution. So at the beginning of the partnership, we were all working on developing all these same practices, shallow flooding that would fit into the annual cycle of rice production primarily. We've begun to expand the scope of that. And bird returns was something that TNC then began to develop fairly independently, but really built on the shoulders of everything the partnership was doing, to develop a habitat, a marketplace in which we could incentivize delivery of seasonal shorebird habitat where and when it was needed the most, using an auction-based model. The idea being that an auction would drive down cost and we could make habitat delivery very cost effective. And so we started running these auctions in 2008. And the way it worked, again, built off stuff that Point Blue and all of our partners have done, was we wanted to use the best available science to pinpoint where you could get the most bang for the buck in delivery of the habitat. And so we're an early sort of investor and partner in developing Water Tracker, which Point Blue has taken much further since then. And it was our way of characterizing in 2-week intervals based on satellite imagery, the probability of having surface water habitat across the entire Central Valley. At the beginning, then we partnered with Cornell Lab of Ornithology to take in new models of probability of occurrence from Cornell and marry these two so we could look to where are birds arriving, where are they in great abundance or great probability of occurrence, and where are their habitat, where's the habitat or where are their habitat deficits. And then we could run an auction and we would select the bids that we got from farmers based on which of those bids were going to deliver the highest value based on these bird habitat value scores that we had. And then we would go under contract with these farmers. And this has been this is still what we're doing to a large degree across all these programs. These bird abundance models have now been greatly improved by our partnership with Point Blue, including Aaron, who's on the call, and Matt, of course, and Kristen, where we're sucking in a whole bunch of data that Point Blue and we've collected over the years on bird returns fields. And in fact, these models are now much, much better. And we're still working with Matt and the team to refine these models using all the data we continue to collect. So what have we done in the last 8 years? So essentially as of about 6 months ago, we had run 17 seasonal habitat auctions with 200 participating farms, delivered about 120,000 acres of seasonal habitat over that period of time. And 60,000 of that was just this past year. And that was because the state saw the value of these programs that we now run collectively, and put a lot of money into, in particular, the Rice Commission's own auction program, which is really a spin-off of bird returns called Bid for Birds. And we continue to support them with technical assistance and modeling and analytics and program delivery. And so we've delivered a lot of habitat. We should be super proud of this. And this is only growing, and we know it's made a difference. So this is an analysis, again, led by Matt. On the left, you see the results that were published in the paper in 2018 of how much habitat was out on the landscape that was a result of incentive programs, other incentive programs, including ones coming through the NRCS, as well as bird returns. And on average, these incentive programs are delivering, from the high 20s up to 40% of the habitat. And in the fall in particular, it can be really, really important. The winter programs are also important, but we focus less on that because you tend to get enough habitat in most years during that time without explicit incentives. On the right is the preliminary results as of about 6 months ago of how we've done just recently. Doesn't have spring data in it yet, that Kristen and Matt helped put together. So again, we're providing a lot of the habitat, and it's delivering real benefits. So over the last several years, we've collected a tremendous amount of data, and this was an early synthesis of bird returns survey data, showing the response of birds on incentive fields, bird returns fields, versus other fields in the rest of the landscape. And we're seeing 2 to 3 times more birds using these incentive fields, which shouldn't be surprising. It's probably a function of some of the little bit of habitat that's out there, particularly in the fall. But it's also a function of that we're delivering habitat these shorebirds need, that's otherwise lacking, even if there were other flooded habitats in the landscape that are too deep. And more recently, we've begun to compile, and this is thanks to Kristen here on the call, and there's more data since then, so this is old already. Over the last 8 years, there's been over 15,000 surveys done by us collectively, counting over 2 million birds. And we're seeing really high densities in the fall and spring on these for shorebirds on the fields that we deliver. And so we know the birds are responding really well. So now I'll pivot to the future. We have a long way to go. This is our goal. And 120,000 acres over 8 years is good, but it's not solving the problem. And we have 2 problems. Is we don't have the scale yet to close the energy gaps that these birds are experiencing. And we don't have the durability to make any line of sight on the durability to make sure the acres that these birds need will be delivered every year forever. And that's a big task. And I don't know how to, this is the problem we're trying to solve right now. And we're doing this in the context of still a changing context. We still have expanded orchard conversion in the valley, remarkably, even in the world of sustainable groundwater management and drought. I just was down in the San Joaquin Valley and saw a bunch of new orchards planted where orchards had failed previously. It's actually unbelievable. And we also see a lot of fallowing and just drying up of the landscape. We know that in the West, we're losing a lot of the natural wetlands. This is just a picture of the Great Salt Lake and the results from Patrick Donnelly, showing that across the West, we have 25 to 50% less seasonal wetland habitat across the Western US, and the Salt Lake this year is in really dire straits. So the whole Intermountain West and the coast are experiencing a massive change in wetlands that don't have water management. So in a lot of these places, there's not a lot we can do if these are drying up in a changing climate to those places in particular. We're also facing a future where agriculture is going to probably expand. This is just a reflection from a new study showing the boundaries. So in red is the expanded zone in which you could expect viable agriculture in the 2050s up into the boreal zone. And the suitability of agricultural lands further to the south will become more, there'll be a big question about how many of these can be maintained in a drying climate. And so this points to both conversion and loss of natural habitat, but it also points to the potential importance of managing working lands well. We see a lot of the working lands across the Americas changing in and of themselves, almost up to 25 million acres of land use change on average over the last 70 years across the Americas. We haven't seen a lot of pasture land loss, which is really important for a lot of water birds and grassland birds, but there's been a net increase, a net loss of pasture lands and a net increase in croplands and aquaculture. So a lot of big change that is the backdrop for all the work we do. And so the question is, what's the, how important are working lands going to be in the future? They're super important now. We have a lot of work to do to just make the ones we have viable and sustainable from a water perspective and good habitat for wildlife. Just to give you some context, there's about 17 million acres of rice in the Americas. There's over 1 million acres of aquaculture now, and that's growing rapidly, and over 500 million acres of pasture land and grazing land that need to be managed well. And so questions that keep me up at night are, how cost effective are these incentive programs? Some preliminary work Brad and I've been doing with the data we have is that, if you play this out, the same amount of money we'd be spending on auctions at the end of 20 to 40 years, you would have spent as much money as it would have taken to buy all of that land, which is always was the premise of bird returns to begin with, that it's cheaper than traditional conservation and buying land. And we are seeing the cost go up. We think that's a function of per acre. That's a function of drought to a degree and water scarcity and water prices. But we are seeing a decline in the dollars per bird habitat, acres per day of habitat. So we're getting more habitat in time for about the same or less price. So there are some signals that the model works, but Brad actually is doing a lot of work right now with new data to understand the cost effectiveness of auction programs versus flat rate programs and things like that. How do we make these long lasting and at scale? What's going to be happening 50 years from now? And that's related to this question of, are these programs a permanent solution or a bridge to something that's completely different? And I have ideas and thoughts on that I'd be happy to talk about. And how can these programs be part of California's and the Flyway's other major challenges like water resilience? And we have some thoughts on that too that we're beginning to explore. And fortunately, we collectively, the three organizations and all our partners, have a huge opportunity now. We just were awarded a $15 million grant from the Department of Fish and Wildlife for bird returns. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be sitting down and asking ourselves, how do we best invest $15 million with these challenges in mind for the Valley and in the context of the broader Flyway? So this is an exciting time for us as organizations. It's going to shape a lot of what we do over the next several years. So love to get your guys' ideas and thoughts as we embark on this next phase. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you. Hand claps. I'm seeing those around. You can do your virtual reaction hand clap. All right. I see those coming in. Thanks so much, Rod. So yeah, we will we'll move into our Q&A. So if you have a question to ask verbally, go ahead and use the hand raise function in the reaction section in your menu, or you can type a question into the chat and I will read that out. And it looks like we've got a first question from Nadav. Go ahead, Nadav.
Thanks. That was great, Rod. I was wondering about water depth. Is that part of the strategy of having different water depths? Because, I mean, different shorebirds would, have the habitat suitability would differ with regard to the water depth. Yeah,
we've generally leaned on sort of a quote unquote optimal sort of 4 inches has been our target because it strikes a good balance between small things and big things. And we know that in general, they're even in rice, which is laser leveled for the most part and very flat, and that you get some variation in depths, and so you can meet the needs of a lot of things. In the other parts of the landscape, it's even easier to expect, like in this delta, for example, where we manage at Staten Island and other places, you have the water on one side of the field that's deep enough for diving ducks, and up on the upper end, you've got great habitat for least sandpipers. So I think in general, that's not our biggest problem. It's you're going to get some diversity habitat because managing water on landscapes is diverse and challenging, and you end up with a lot of different stuff. I think our bigger challenge is to get landowners who've traditionally been asked to or have their own reasons to want to manage for ducks to create that diversity and stay below 8 inches or 12 inches.
Nice, thanks.
Thanks.
And Julian, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about like how much effort is being spent communicating some of these successes back to the landowner?
Getting, oops,
Pardon me?
Go ahead. Corey was just off mic there.
Yeah, so communicating the successes back to the landowner in terms of birds on their site or even just birds kind of generally in that area where you've been working, like successes of the program. And asking this because I'm thinking about what you said about long term, especially the forever long term. And, should this break down, are there opportunities for like some kind of stewardship to take place?
I think my answer to that, and others here might have thoughts here. Early on, we did a lot of that. We were creating laminated things for their trucks and getting, a lot of input on that. And I think, and that was all with the rice community. And the rice community was already dialed in on waterfowl, right? And they have a whole propaganda machine built to tell this story. And so, but what we did succeed in doing is getting them to recognize the value of other birds. And so even if, we're not part of a meeting, you'll see them actually bring shorebirds up. So I think we've succeeded in that regard in the rice community. I think it remains to be seen whether we can bring a bunch of other farming communities along, and we're at the beginning of that. And I think your point's a good one that and this actually came up in our call with our CDFW partner who's going to manage this grant with us, that he's very interested in whether we can do the training and provide the resources and the educational materials to inspire landowners to continue doing this when the money runs out. And I think that gets right to your question.
Great question. I'm not seeing any other hand raises right now or comments in the chat. So, there we go. Corey's got a hand raise.
And Hieronymus got two.
Oh.
Hey, Rod, thanks for the talk. We see in the years that we have these droughts, or I guess when we have a little bit more water abundance, we get, at least on the NRCS program side, we get some more people signing up for fall flooding or late summer flooding. And then when a year like this and nobody has water allotments, you get very little of that. So it gets me thinking about kind of like, and I hear a lot of the rice community talking about selling their water rights down to people doing water transfers. Does it ever make sense, or what if you all thought through like whether getting in the business of water starts making sense for us from an economic standpoint, like buying water? Does it just get too ridiculously expensive to meet the goals? And I guess that you also probably have to have land to buy water because the water rights come with the land. But I'm curious, what's that side of the equation?
It's a great question, and I have a very long answer that I'm not going to give you now, but we're all over this. I'll give you a short version, and I'm happy to talk with people about this. And this is something I'm sharing with Catherine and Sammy because it's mostly a TNC effort right now. But so what happens in years like this, for those of you who don't know, is bunch of other people in the Southern Valley, in this Bay Area, and in Los Angeles, they come to the Sacramento Valley to buy water during drought, and they buy it from the rice community because they have a crap ton of water and they can sell it for very high prices. And when that happens, they fallow the fields, which is bad for birds, ducks, and everything included. And by policy, you cannot, even if you had some water, you're not allowed to do a little bit of flooding on those fallowed fields by policy, because what the DWR is trying to do is not increase water demand, which makes sense. So we're in the midst of trying to institutionalize a leave behind concept, what we call next generation transfer programs, where any transfer that happens has a leave behind associated with it. And so Jeannie on my team, and we've been using eddy covariance towers with David's engineering to measure how much water does our shorebird habitat use. And that is defining our leave behind. And they actually just had a meeting with DWR this morning, and we're going to try and pilot it this year. We're going to try and buy water with an urban water district. And we're going to pay for the leave behind and demonstrate what this will look like. And I actually think this is the future of water management in the Valley. It's more complicated than I just described it, but we can talk more later.
You just planted that question with Corey. Did you do that beforehand, Rod?
The leave behinds though, would you probably then also target, I'm assuming, the shoulder seasons, the late summer
And in the middle of a drought,
spring.
you'd extend that because we lose all that winter habitat too. And the joint venture's goal for winter, like normally the seasonal habitat's the problem, but explicitly in the joint venture's goal is protect the 350,000 acres on average of winter flooded rice. If that disappears, that's bad news bears for a lot of things too.
Well, and I think, Geronimo, I think you had a comment on Julian's earlier question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. We do send to at least the wetland owners who are participating in the program, we send them like a summary report of the birds that were observed on their properties and how it relates to the overall picture of how many birds were observed and that sort of thing. Yeah, so definitely smaller number of acres in those incentive programs, but more and more people are getting excited about that their wetlands can provide these added benefits for other species. So
that's cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. I'm just wondering if you can, maybe you mentioned this when you were presenting, but are you guys in these studies that are coming out, or how are we distinguishing sort of about the quality of habitat, right? So one of the narratives we now hear from our friends in the Sac Valley is that all wetlands are or all wet ground is the same, more or less. And, at least from the policy perspective, I think one of our pieces of advocacy has been around, we need to protect like the refuge wetlands, the areas that are sort of managed as wetlands first, and then the other flooded fields second, in a way, because of the added value of the wetland areas. But is that true? Like, are we measuring sort of a distinction in importance between the areas that are managed wetlands versus, say, flooded rice?
Yeah. For those who are not in the inside baseball, like what's behind Mike's comment is, if in the fight for water, there's now this debate, like, because we've been fighting to make sure the wetlands get more water than they're being allotted in a crazy water allotment scheme. And this came up recently. I don't know if Catherine, you and I were talking about it. I was talking about it with a few people, and frankly, I don't think we have a good answer to that. So we've built a storyline that points to rice as good as wetlands. But I think on the face of it, if you think about the overall diversity of things supported in wetlands, that wetlands on a per acre basis are going to be much more valuable for a whole suite of things. But to my knowledge, we don't have those data like at our fingertips pointing to that. And I think we need to do a better job of it, because we do now battle that narrative. That said, rice still is, an order of magnitude more habitat when it's fully online, and especially if it's managed the way we want it to be managed, than the wetlands we have in the Valley.
Yeah, I just added a little bit, having been on the wetland reserve easements NRCS has and relative to rice, there's a huge difference in things like plant diversity in these sites. If you start looking at other ecosystem metrics, they're different for sure.
Yeah, I think that, and I know, sorry, Jillian, to jump in front of you, but on the thought that I think that's an important point, Corey, because I think often we've gone to partners, and so much of the wetland conservation has traditionally been so focused on waterfowl. And now, yes, shorebirds, after a couple of decades of persistent reminding of partners about it, but there's also, there's a whole other suite of birds and plants and just flora and fauna that aren't served. And not to diminish at all the contribution of rice lands, but I mean,
no, we need to put these data together, and that was actually a subject of a recent conversation. And I think even some of the work Christy's done and Matt and others, we really need to put this together, because I think it's an important part of how we defend water for wetlands. Julian.
Yeah, this kind of follows up that sort of habitat quality question. I seem to remember from my days at talking to the water managers, land managers like Sumnus and also like the South Bay salt ponds, like there's ways in which you can flood up a field that produce more beneficial insects and invertebrates for birds. I don't remember the whole strategies, but flooding it up kind of slowly and over time, and a lot, basically like cooking the water and allowing that to bloom. So my question is there any element to that when you're working with these farmers in how they flood up their fields, and can that be used as a way to boost the habitat value?
Not very much. We do, there are managements. So generally in the terms of flood up, draw down, we've focused mostly, and Kristen or others might want to say something about this, but slow their drawdown down, because when they decide to flood, drain the field, they do it really quickly. And so part of what we've been incentivizing is slowing that drawdown. But that's not the issue of going from dry to wet and the relative value of doing that slowly. I mean, this is also sort of to Nadav's question about diversity. I think the variation in fields and how fast these fields flood up and stuff, I think you get a lot of that variation anyway. It'll be interesting to see possibly what we're all working closely with cow trout and other partners now on a fish food and looking at the bird benefits of that. And that whole thing is designed to flood up fields quickly, produce a ton of invertebrates in the water column, then they flush the field, send those invertebrates into the river for fish to make them fat and happy, or fatter and happier. And we've been looking at the bird benefits of that practice. I think we have some work to do to convince them to do a better job on the birds than they seem to be willing to do. But we might learn something from that, because we have been working with the GUSGS to also sample the invertebrates in the soil that the shorebirds would be responding to in those flood up and flood down experiments.
Kristen, do you want to add anything to that?
Nope, Rod got it. Thank you.
We're so complimentary. We're so like.
Kristen and I are a tag team. We show up at media events together. Like we're attached at the hip.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only thing I'd add was that sometimes, there are constraints in these rice fields that, like they get their water and they can't just let it sit around in the canal. They have to like, get it into the field. So there are some constraints like that maybe we could push a little bit, but sometimes they just got to put it somewhere and get it out of somebody else's way who's getting another delivery kind of thing.
Yeah.
We had a question in the chat from Corey, and it was answered by Geronimo. Corey asked how much of managed wetlands, public and private, are unutilized for flooding in the late summer and early spring. And Geronimo shared in late summer, not very much. In early spring, there's a growing number of acres that are being utilized for flooding through mid to late April. Does anybody on the team want to add to that?
Yes, just that, they're trying to grow duck food. And so there are constraints around that, and when they can and can't add water, because it could impact the duck food.
Yeah. And I'll also add that a big focus of this next round with the $15 million grant is going to be semi-permanent wetlands. Those are the kind of wetland that's been lost broadly across the West, and our CDFW partners really want us to add that dimension to it. To get some habitat into the summer that'll be brood water for ducks, but also that drawdown of that will provide the very early fall migration season habitat for shorebirds. And it's actually, it can constrict or conflict with duck food production, but it's a great way to control weed problems that some of these wetlands are facing. So we're going to be experimenting with that.
Nice. I have sort of a broad question, and you may have sort of addressed it already in your presentation, but this seems like a very contentious issue, like water management in California, and for our partnership to fight to keep birds at the table in the conversation in California seems like a tall task, but we've been pretty successful at it so far, which is very impressive. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, from your perspective, Rod, and the rest of the team, like, what are kind of like the major sort of values and maybe policies that drive success in this fight?
You're not catching me at an optimistic moment.
I kind of wanted to mic lines.
Mike might want to say some things about this. This has been a, this year, and if next year is dry again, which predictions are pointing to another dry year, this year has been very, very tough. We've been in, Mike's been part of this, and we wrote a letter to the Secretary of Interior, not demanding, but politely asking for them to deliver more water to wetlands. That did not make our rice friends happy, and we've been having lots of conversations about that. We've been putting a lot of pressure on the Bureau of Reclamation. This is politically very fraught, and next year is going to be a shit show if it's dry. So this is going to be a very, very tough political challenge for us to navigate. But we're doing a good job of it right now, I would say. We're trying to stick to our guns and defend, nature's right to some of this water, and find creative, what we think can be voluntary solutions, but not bend too far and get, the crumbs. We need more.
So like some of the values might be just kind of like emphasizing the value, like the benefits that come to all living things when we do these. And then I think you said, was it Brad that was working on some more economic analysis, like the economic gains? So it's impressive that we've done what we've done so far. And so I'm just
totally. Yeah, the economics analysis so far is more on the cost of these programs. How much bang for the buck are we getting for the birds? We haven't gone into the realm, although some of the work Brad's been doing with Jeannie lately is looking at the economics of that, back to answering earlier question about, like, Corey's question about getting in the water business. Like, we're going to do a pilot where we're buying water, and we're looking at how much is that water worth in the context of a very high rice market. So how much is rice worth? How much is water worth? How much are we going to have to pay? How much do we need to get the cities to pay? But I had an answer to your other part of that question, but yeah, I think the narrative we're battling against, or we're sort of battling against, is, we, the farmers, produce food for the world. That's a hard narrative to compete with. And I'm very interested in what the actual answer is. So my answer to water in California, as some of you already know, is we have to shrink. There's no choice but to shrink the agricultural footprint in California. We can't get to water sustainability and have the balance of things we want without that. So how do we get there? And then you have to ask yourself, okay, what if there was, on average, 20% less rice all the time, and 20% less X, and a bunch of orchards, once they reach their lifespan, come out of production? That's the kind of stuff we're doing in the San Joaquin Valley. And that's the world we need to get to. And I think there's voluntary ways to get there. And I'm not against paying them for the benefits they will create by giving that up. But it's a tough conversation right now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this gets at some real big national global issues, right? So yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Rod. Thank you all of our guest audience members for joining our Ecolunch today. This was awesome. Thanks, Catherine, for spearheading this topic and bringing everybody together. Really appreciate the time. And Catherine, do you want to share any end sentiments here for this topic?
No, we're at one. Just thank everybody for joining. So we got folks from different organizations, which is fun too, for Ecolunch, and let's keep that up.
Yeah,
Sweet.
cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Great questions. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
I'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.